In 1979, a woman was declared dead in Phoenix. Hours later, in the basement of a city morgue, she opened her eyes and whispered a name no one had ever heard: Elijah Voss. Authorities traced her to a forgotten patch of Arizona desert, where they found ash, oxygen masks, and a circle of melted chairs. No bodies, no survivors, just one object still moving, a red metronome, ticking in the wind. The cult that once lived there called themselves the Crimson Threshold. They claimed death wasn't the end, just a test. And their leader? He vanished without a trace. No arrests, no explanation, just fragments, blueprints of rooms that don't exist, ritual instructions buried in medical logs, and whispers of something called the return. What happened in the desert? And how many never came back? On the morning of June 17, 1979, at approximately 6:42 a.m., a coroner's assistant at the Maricopa County Morgue in Phoenix, Arizona, entered Cold Room 3 to begin preparing a female cadaver for autopsy. The body had been delivered overnight from a rural health clinic near Camp Verde. The preliminary death report cited respiratory failure following presumed cardiac arrest. Time of death: 1:08 a.m. The woman had been pronounced dead by a licensed nurse practitioner after field resuscitation failed. She was identified as Cora Fletcher, age 26, no known relatives in Arizona. The body was cold, no pulse, no corneal reflex. The death paperwork was stamped and signed, but when the assistant unzipped the body bag, the woman's chest moved, then again. Then she exhaled audibly, wet, shallow, but unmistakably alive. Emergency services were summoned. Resuscitation was initiated, this time with success. Her pulse returned, erratic at first. Her pupils were dilated and unresponsive. Hospital logs note that within minutes of stabilization, the woman began speaking in short bursts, repeating phrases in what was initially assumed to be a foreign language. Later analysis determined it was English, but highly rhythmic, spoken in a staccato cadence resembling breath control exercises. According to the attending ER physician, the woman's first fully coherent word, spoken with great effort, was Voss. At the time, the name held no known significance. Fletcher was moved to an intensive care unit under neurological observation. Toxicology revealed unusually high levels of pentobarbital and atropine, drugs commonly used in deep sedation, rarely in combination. No prescription or medical record indicated she had legal access to either. Fingerprint analysis yielded no matches in national law enforcement databases. The clinic that had pronounced her dead provided only a first name and a rural drop-off location. No attending physician, no medical records, no billing code. 2 days after regaining full consciousness, Fletcher was interviewed by a county investigator. The transcript, later partially declassified, is disjointed. She speaks of numbers, sequences, countdowns, repeats the phrase "red hour" 9 times in under 2 minutes. When asked directly who Voss is, she goes silent. The investigator notes that her arms are marked with faint bruises and bands, consistent with restraint. Her hair had been recently shaved underneath a ceremonial wrap. Her fingernails were clean, but her knuckles were raw. A small red cloth, tied tightly around her wrist when found, bore no branding or label. Its stitching was hand-done, uneven, and matched no local tailoring patterns. Fletcher refused to remove it. When hospital staff attempted to cut it, she began hyperventilating and reciting what sounded like a practiced chant: "Return once, return whole, return light." After 7 days, she was released into psychiatric care under state custody. The name Voss became the central focus of a new investigation, one that would eventually lead detectives deep into the Arizona highlands, to a burned structure with no signage, no formal records, and no survivors. The case file was labeled Crimson Threshold. Fletcher never denied being part of it. She simply said, "We were trying to be ready," and then she stopped speaking altogether. The name Elijah Voss first appeared in Maricopa County case files on July 2, 1979, 15 days after Cora Fletcher regained consciousness. A background trace initiated by the state's Behavioral Health Board connected the name to a small publishing imprint in Flagstaff, Arizona. Among the archive titles was a self-published manuscript, Crossing the Threshold, A Dialogue with Death, authored by Elijah M. Voss. The book was printed in 1974. Fewer than 50 copies were distributed. Voss had no criminal record, but his paper trail, though thin, showed a life marked by instability and ideological drift. He enrolled at Trinity Baptist Seminary in 1963, withdrew in 1965 without completing his second year, and enlisted in the U.S. Army Medical Corps shortly after. Deployed to Vietnam in 1966, Voss served as a battlefield medic until 1969. According to declassified VA records, he was treated for sleep disruption, disassociation, and auditory hallucinations, but was never formally diagnosed with PTSD. He received an honorable discharge. Between 1970 and 1972, Voss lived in 3 states: Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico. No known employment records, but multiple addresses list him as the occupant of rented trailers or shared housing. In mid-1973, he purchased 11 acres of undeveloped land north of Camp Verde under the name Red Line Community Trust, a non-profit organization filed with the state using boilerplate language about alternative health research and faith-based community service. Local zoning approvals noted plans for 2 small buildings and an open-air meditation structure. No complaints were registered. The construction was completed by 1974. Neighbors, ranchers, and seasonal residents described the new occupants as quiet, strange, orderly. One man recalled seeing a group dressed in red carrying buckets uphill at sunrise. A county surveyor who visited the area in 1975 described the land as clean but oddly barren, with gravel paths that formed a rough circle around a central adobe chapel. No one remembered ever meeting Elijah Voss in person. That same year, a flagged purchase order for 50 units of concentrated sodium thiopental, normally restricted for hospital sedation, was linked to a veterinary supply account registered to the Red Line Community Trust. The request was denied, but the attempt was never investigated. Crossing the Threshold, the only known writing by Voss, was reviewed by a university philosophy professor in Tucson after a student submitted it as a supplemental reference. In his notes, the professor described it as theologically unstable, dangerously obsessive, and built around the misuse of sacrificial metaphors. Passages from the book include, "The spirit is not born clean, it is born chaotic. Only by stepping beyond the breath and returning in rhythm does it find order. There is no divinity in survival, only in return." The book outlined a system of rituals designed to simulate death under controlled, voluntary circumstances. The goal, according to Voss, was reversion, a term he defined as spiritual reset achieved only by a temporary cessation of vital signs. Between 1974 and 1979, there is no known record of contact between Voss and any public institution. He did not pay property taxes directly. Funds were submitted through a pooled trust account. No phone lines were registered to the compound. No electrical service was documented. Solar equipment and water tanks were later found, buried in the sand behind the chapel's remains. By the time investigators reached the site in 1979, it had been burned and abandoned. But by then, Cora Fletcher's recovery had already made one thing clear. Whoever Elijah Voss was, he wasn't alone. Recovered during a 1979 property sweep of an abandoned bookstore in Sedona, Arizona, a single surviving copy of the Codex of Return became the foundation for understanding the internal logic of the Crimson Threshold. Bound in unmarked red cloth with no ISBN or publisher, the 118-page manual bore no author credit, but matched Elijah Voss's writing style as seen in Crossing the Threshold. Both texts share phrasing, syntax, and structure, but the codex was far more specific and operational. The text was not a philosophical essay. It was instructional. Broken into 7 sections, the codex outlined a series of physical, mental, and chemical preparations to be undertaken prior to what Voss termed a controlled voluntary cessation. The terminology avoided references to death or dying. Instead, Voss's vocabulary reframed these states as thresholds, moments of potential clarity through biological suspension. Chapter titles included Rhythms of the Pre-Return State Breath Retention in Reversal Nutritional Purification, Before Entry Alignment for the Witness Room, Mantra, Loops for Transition Duration. According to the Codex, purity was not moral, it was mechanical. A person's body, when synchronized to the correct breath ratio and sensory deprivation cycle, could drop into stillness and, after a timed sequence, return through rhythm alone. Handwritten annotations in the margins of the Sedona copy, believed to be from an initiate, note trial durations of 5 to 9 minutes, with notations like cold return 5:28, felt float, no flash, red hour 7:03, black edges, held breath too long. These entries aligned closely with toxicology results from Cora Fletcher's recovery. Her blood work revealed an unusual combination of sedatives and muscle relaxants, substances that, when combined, can induce a state that mimics clinical death under specific conditions. The dosages suggested planning and repeat experimentation. Interviews with 3 former members, conducted under anonymity in early 1980, confirmed the codex was central to daily life inside the compound. Members were required to memorize entire chapters and recite them during sleep cycles. Mistakes in recitation were met with fasting or temporary isolation. One former member stated, "It wasn't just belief, it was math. You either got the timing right, or you didn't come back, and if you didn't, that was part of the process." Diagrams inside the codex described positions for the body: the return pose, the second suspension, and the still crescent. Each included breathing counts, eyelid closure patterns, and instructions for minimizing involuntary movement. Medical experts later consulted by law enforcement concluded the rituals bore resemblance to extreme forms of auto-sedation and breath-hold training, similar to techniques used by free divers. However, these practices, when applied in enclosed, unmonitored environments and amplified with sedatives, posed high risk of brain damage or death. The Codex also introduced a social hierarchy based on proximity to successful returns. Those who had crossed once were labeled witnesses. Those preparing were breathers. The group's inner circle reportedly consisted entirely of confirmed witnesses. By mid-1977, investigators believed the group had performed dozens of controlled rituals. A tally sheet discovered beneath the burned chapel floor contained 54 initials with timestamps. 8 were circled in red. Authorities now suspect those marked times correspond to members who failed to return. Despite its disturbing content, the Codex of Return was never formally banned. It remains locked in evidence storage, cataloged under the Crimson Threshold case file. What disturbed investigators wasn't just the content, but the clarity. There were no delusions, no mysticism, just a system, and those who followed it believed that to become pure, one had to leave life briefly and then come back precisely. When investigators reached the remnants of the Crimson Threshold compound in August 1979, only the foundations remained. The main structure, a central adobe chapel and 4 dormitory wings, had been destroyed by fire weeks earlier, but beneath the scorched soil, fragments of layout and routine could still be traced, and what they revealed was unsettling. The building had no standard floor plan. Instead, it followed a circular arrangement, each room feeding into a single corridor that looped around the inner chapel. Doors led inward, not out, and every door investigators documented featured a locking mechanism on the hall-facing side only. There were no handles on the interior. County records confirmed the compound was off-grid. No public utilities, no registered septic or well permits. Excavations found buried plastic tanks and a primitive filtration system. Showers were gravity-fed from rooftop drums. Electricity came from a small solar array with limited output, most of it routed to a low-voltage timer system hardwired into the chapel floor. There were no visible clocks anywhere on the premises. 2 recovered blueprints, drawn by hand and dated 1974, were later analyzed by architects. They revealed deliberate omissions. No egress plans, no secondary exits, no standard ventilation. Vent shafts were narrow, irregular, and often sealed from within by insulation foam and fabric. Windows, where present, measured no more than 10 inches across, too small to pass through, too high to see out of. Photographic evidence from a pre-fire visitor, captured in 1976 and submitted anonymously, showed residents dressed in uniform crimson robes, no footwear, heads shaved, most faces partially obscured by cloth. In the background, doors can be seen, unmarked, handleless, uniform. Inside those rooms, survivors later said, the environment was strictly controlled. Each member was assigned to a cell-like space no larger than 6 feet by 9. Bedding consisted of thin mats. No personal items were permitted beyond a red journal and a water bowl. Lighting was dim and activated only during set wake cycles, which followed no discernible 24-hour pattern. Witness statements from former members consistently mentioned disorientation. One recalled, "There were no sunrises, no clocks, just voice cues. If you ever thought too long about the time, someone would notice." The voice cues came through small speakers embedded in the walls. They relayed instructions, recitations from the codex, and countdown drills. These drills were recorded on cassette tapes and played repeatedly, guiding members through breath hold exercises that intensified over time. The goal was endurance, precision, total surrender of voluntary breath. An inspection of the chapel's lower storage room uncovered dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled by date and initials. Audio analysis revealed sequences of whispered countdowns intercut with ambient tone pulses, likely used for synchronization during group exercises. Entry into the compound was controlled. Members arrived in pairs or trios, escorted in private vehicles with windows obscured. Upon entry, they relinquished identification. Legal names were replaced with numerical designations. A ledger found partially intact listed names crossed out and replaced with 4-digit codes beginning with R, presumed to stand for returnee. Family records, bank accounts, and outside communication ceased immediately. One former member described the moment as closing the door on yourself before someone else could. There is no evidence that members were physically forced to stay, but the architecture did the work. Leaving would have required breaking a lock or drawing attention, both considered acts of failure, punishable by reset rituals in the still room. No one who stayed past the first 30 days ever left willingly, and from that point forward, every breath they took was measured and timed. Uniformity inside the Crimson Threshold compound wasn't symbolic, it was enforced. Every resident wore the same garment, a floor-length red robe made from coarse muslin. Each had a collar stitched with thread-drawn initials, always 3 letters, never names. According to interviews with former members, the robes were issued upon entry, replacing all personal clothing. They were never to be removed in communal spaces, including dormitories, dining areas, and during rituals. Red was not chosen at random. Within the Codex of Return, the color red is referenced over 40 times, described as the hue of resistance and release. In ritual terminology, red marked the liminal state, neither dead nor alive, neither awake nor dreaming. Voss believed red garments aligned the body with the threshold mindset. One passage read, The skin must forget its identity. Red carries breath across the boundary. Physical obedience extended far beyond attire. Daily life in the compound was highly regulated, down to posture and movement. Initiates were instructed to walk with measured steps, heel, toe, matching the beat of a metronome that played on loop throughout the corridors. The device, recovered after the fire, had been modified to run on an independent battery pack. It was found still functioning, buried beneath ash, ticking steadily at 60 beats per minute. Laughter was strongly discouraged, so was humming, spontaneous speech, or gestures not aligned with the daily sequence. In testimony, one member recalled, "You learned to keep your face blank. Stillness was praised. Emotion was something you unlearned. Meals were eaten in silence, observed by senior witnesses seated at elevated stools. The menu never varied. Steamed lentils, boiled rice, filtered water. The food was prepared without salt or spice. Consumption was timed. Each meal lasted exactly 12 minutes, including a post-meal cleansing period, where each person rinsed their mouth and returned their bowl to a designated tray. Variations or delays were met with citation, what members called red slips. Recovered journals from lower-tier members included handwritten tallies of these citations. One read, "Red slip, blinked too long in morning chant. Red slip, spoke out of sequence. Red slip, sat early during meal count." At night, dormitory lights dimmed simultaneously. Before lying down, members stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. The same recording played across all rooms, a monotone voice counting down slowly from 100. This nightly ritual, known as descending, was intended to ease the mind into what Voss described as a pre-return state. Some members began to mouth the numbers in their sleep. Each resident was required to submit a weekly breath log. These documents, stored in the chapel's archive, contained detailed notations of retention times, rates of breath per minute, and pulse readings when available. Breath efficiency was treated as spiritual merit. The longer one could hold, the closer they were said to be to reversion readiness. A high-ranking former witness, interviewed under immunity, claimed, "It wasn't discipline. It was architecture, social, psychological. Every red thread you wore reminded you. Your body didn't belong to you anymore. Your breath was borrowed." In every photograph recovered from the site, Polaroids, passport-style ID shots, ritual documentation, there is one constant: the color red, not faded, not maroon, pure crimson. Not a single member wore anything else, and not one of them smiled. Her name was Leona Morell, a 31-year-old former biology teacher from Flagstaff who joined the Crimson Threshold in March 1974. Prior to her arrival, she withdrew from her teaching position, closed her personal bank account, and left a brief resignation letter with the school district, citing spiritual necessity. That was the last official record of her existence under her legal name. By May, internal ledgers from the compound listed her as R3115. According to testimonial evidence provided by a former senior witness, Leona volunteered for a depth ritual just 7 weeks after her induction. These rituals, known internally as R sessions, were structured breath deprivation exercises, often lasting up to 10 minutes. Participants were sedated using barbiturates prepared in-house, then monitored by trained witnesses tasked with managing timing and revival. On the night of June 9, 1974, Leona entered the still room with 2 other members. Each had recorded pre-ritual reflections in their assigned codex journals, documenting body temperature, pulse rate, and breath stability. Her final entry, later recovered from a sealed crate near the chapel's remains, read, "I am ready to go where the air doesn't reach. Return is a choice." Records indicate her countdown cycle was timed at 6 minutes and 45 seconds, standard for late-stage breath trial participants. However, Leona never regained consciousness. CPR was attempted. No medical equipment was used beyond manual resuscitation. Her death was not reported to any civil authority. Instead, she was buried at sunrise. Satellite imagery taken in late 1979, 5 years after her death, revealed a small, uniform mound behind the dormitory wing. A crude wooden stake, painted red, had since collapsed in the sand. Forensic teams, acting on statements from former members, excavated the site in early 1980. They uncovered a single coffin constructed from untreated pine. Inside were human remains, confirmed through dental records to be those of Leona Morell. Her body showed no signs of external trauma. Traces of pentobarbital and chloral hydrate were found in bone samples. Experts concluded that the dosage was high enough to induce respiratory suppression in an otherwise healthy adult. Whether administered voluntarily or not remains unclear. Voss did not treat her death as a failure. Within days, he referred to her as the first to cross, a title later used in multiple entries of the Codex of Return. Her death was reframed as transcendence. He claimed she had reversed into light and chose not to return. Her status became emblematic of total surrender. New initiates were taught her name in their first week. Her image was used in ritual instruction. In the compound's only surviving group photo, a small frame of her portrait can be seen propped beside the central metronome. One former member recalled, "We didn't mourn her. We repeated her name before every countdown. She was what we were all trying to be." Her legacy extended into the architecture. The still room where she died was unofficially renamed Morell's Crossing. Those selected to perform depth rituals were said to be following her breath. The language surrounding her became codified, clinical, detached from death. The concept of dying was removed entirely, replaced with crossing, reversion, or simply release. No legal death certificate was ever filed under her name. Her family, contacted years later, believed she had relocated for work overseas. They never knew she was buried in the desert. Her name erased, her breath counted, her silence canonized. Within the crimson threshold, her absence was not loss. It was doctrine. In 1980, during the final forensic sweep of the Crimson Threshold compound ruins, a rusted metal conduit was uncovered behind what remained of the chapel's eastern wall. At first assumed to be part of the destroyed electrical infrastructure, it was later identified as a makeshift audio system, consisting of bundled copper wire and a small condenser microphone mounted behind a carved vent panel. It was one of 6. Audio technicians brought in by the state confirmed the system was primitive but operational. The wiring led to a small sealed crawl space beneath the chapel dais, where a box of cassette tapes was discovered. Each tape was labeled with dates and initials, consistent with previous breath logs, but these recordings were not voice instructions. They were surveillance. They captured breathing. Dozens of hours of breath cycles were found archived. No conversations, no ambient movement, only slow, metronomic inhales and exhales, recorded with near-clinical precision. The tapes were reviewed by law enforcement, and select segments were analyzed by medical experts, who noted clear attempts at synchronized breathing across large groups. Deviations were few. When they occurred, they were marked. In one recording dated October 4th, 1975, a loud gasp breaks the silence at the 11-minute mark. The breath is irregular, panicked. The tape ends immediately after. That tape bore the red mark R4192. The designation matched the codex file of a member identified only as Ira. Her name appears again, crossed out, in a ritual attendance log the following week. Survivors interviewed under conditional immunity confirmed the purpose of the vents. Microphones were placed throughout the chapel and dormitory wings, installed under direction from the inner circle. Their function was surveillance, not of speech, but of breath. Breath was central to the Crimson Threshold's theology. According to the Codex of Return, rhythm signified spiritual alignment. Controlled breathing, repeated in sequence, demonstrated readiness for reversion. Any interruption, hiccups, gasps, unscheduled sighs, was logged as spiritual corruption. Witnesses claimed that the phrase was not metaphorical. "If you broke rhythm more than once," said one former member, "you were pulled aside. No yelling, no punishment, just a hand on your shoulder and a walk to the still room." The still room, first mentioned in Chapter 6, was a sealed chamber beneath the chapel, outfitted with padded walls and a single mat. The only light came from a low wattage bulb on a 2-hour timer. Inside, a metronome ticked continuously. The recalibration ritual, as described in member journals, lasted a minimum of 6 hours. The participant would breathe in time with the ticking while reciting passages from the codex under supervision. Entry logs recovered from the scorched hallway outside the chamber list 37 known sessions. 9 of the names never appear again in subsequent records. One member's journal entry, dated March 1976, reads, "I dropped breath, no warning, just woke up in the still room. Took 12 hours to hear my own rhythm again." There is no evidence that physical force was used in these recalibrations, but mental fatigue, disorientation, and prolonged breath hold cycles under surveillance created an environment of total physiological control. The walls did not echo voices, they echoed lungs, and when a breath broke pattern, the system responded, not with punishment, but with silence, and then a door that clicked shut. Just once. In the 1979 field report submitted by Special Investigator Daniel Metz, a brief note stood out in the final paragraph. Children were present, at least 6, possibly more, ages unknown, all indoctrinated. That sentence would become the basis for a second wave of inquiry into the Crimson Threshold, this time focused not on the rituals of its adult members, but on its youngest, the children born inside. Between 1975 and 1979, at least 4 confirmed births occurred within the compound. County health records show no registered births under the names of the known mothers. Midwives from outside the community were never called. Delivery logs, as reconstructed from seized medical ledgers, show coded references to arrival events labeled with single letters A, B, C, and D. Blood samples recovered from linens in the burned maternity quarters were later used to confirm infant presence. By 1976, the community's daily routine began to incorporate structured training sessions for these children. Former members described them as early rhythms, supervised breath hold cycles conducted in silence. Beginning as early as 18 months of age, infants were laid on mats, while older children recited synchronized countdowns from 20 to 0, slowly increasing in duration as they aged. One former witness provided detailed descriptions under protective testimony. They told the kids that God didn't live in the sky or the earth, but in the quiet between breaths. The longer you stayed in the silence, the closer you got to him. Children who failed to hold their breath were not scolded, but separated, placed in isolation rooms with dim lighting and no verbal contact for several hours. They were given only audio recordings of the codex to listen to, often looped countdowns delivered in calm, repetitive voices. In one such recording, later recovered from a charred tape cassette marked "Y Training," a soft male voice repeats, "Breath is the bridge, hold it, cross it, return clean." Journals from adult members suggest that by the age of 4, some children were voluntarily holding their breath long enough to lose consciousness. These faintings were praised as signs of early return readiness. In a 1978 entry from an Inner Circle member's logbook, the following is noted. Child Z entered the still state at 4:41 p.m. Duration, 47 seconds. No panic. Full surrender. Witnessed by 3. Logged. The Arizona Department of Child Welfare opened a sealed report in 1981 after additional witness testimony revealed that return trials involving minors had taken place. Though no physical harm could be definitively proven, all recovered documentation was indirect. Descriptions, third-party observations, and secondary effects. No videos or photographs of the rituals themselves survived the fire. However, drawings recovered from a charred child's notebook depicted stick figures in red robes, standing in rows, mouths open wide with visible countdowns written above their heads. The children were not taught numbers in the traditional sense. They learned to count backward only, always backward. By the time the compound was raided, no children were present. Their whereabouts remain unknown. Authorities believe they were either removed in the final weeks or never registered outside the compound to begin with. In the context of the Crimson Thresholds doctrine, children were not simply born. They were designed, raised not with lullabies, but with silence, and their earliest memories weren't words or colors. They were numbers and the space between them. In mid-1977, the Crimson Threshold's internal protocols shifted dramatically. What had once been individualized breath rituals, quiet, isolated, and carefully monitored, evolved into collective ceremonies, known to members as Red Hour. These group events marked a clear escalation in both scale and risk. The earliest documented reference appears in a torn page from the Codex Annex recovered during the 1979 sweep. In red ink, 10 enter, 10 cross. The rhythm of many is the rhythm of return. The phrase became a motto among senior witnesses. Former member journals described the transformation. Rituals moved from the still room to a new space carved into the sandstone beneath the chapel, what participants referred to as the Chamber of Alignment. Accessed through a narrow stairwell behind the eastern alcove, the chamber was ventilated only through a single ceiling shaft. The air was thin, the silence total. Inside, 10 floor mats were arranged in a precise circle, each marked with chalked initials. Before each session, participants drank a measured tonic containing chloral hydrate and a mild barbiturate, prepared by a compound chemist known only as Mira. According to forensic records, the dosages varied slightly based on breath hold history logged in individual journals. Each participant wore a red cloth mask lined with gauze, soaked lightly in peppermint oil, believed to aid with breath control and mask the stench of sweat and vomit, both common outcomes. Timers were started in unison. Each breath was counted down by a witness sitting outside the chamber. Using a pulse metronome routed through a speaker embedded in the wall, the door was sealed until the full sequence elapsed, 10 minutes. Witnesses were under strict instruction not to intervene. Survivor testimony details what happened afterward. Some would twitch back, choke, vomit, gasp like they were drowning, but if someone didn't move after 3 minutes, they were labeled stilled. It wasn't failure, it was devotion. Records suggest at least 6 Red Hour ceremonies were held between August 1977 and April 1978. Attendance logs, recovered from a scorched ledger marked Alignment Registry, show 10 initials listed per session, next to each name. A simple mark, check mark, or null symbol, with participants who never resumed breath. Despite the fatality rate, the rituals continued. One entry from Elijah Voss's personal codex reads, "The soul makes its own choice. Some return with rhythm. Some stay with silence. The still ones are closest to purity." There is no evidence that consent was withdrawn by any participant prior to entry. However, forensic pathologists examining exhumed remains found signs of prolonged oxygen deprivation, inconsistent with safe breath work. Cerebral edema, ruptured capillaries, and aspiration were common. The silence following each Red Hour was ritualized. For 12 hours post-ceremony, the entire compound entered a state of total quiet. No speech, no movement outside assigned quarters. Red flags were hung across the chapel doors. A bell chimed once at dawn, the only permitted sound. To outsiders, these deaths would appear accidental, if not undetectable. But inside the compound, they were sacraments. By the end of 1978, the threshold had widened. It was no longer about breath. It was about the line between silence and permanence. And more were crossing than coming back. Cora Fletcher's name first appeared on state records in June 1979, admitted to the Maricopa County Coroner's Office as an unidentified deceased adult female. She was processed at 3:27 a.m., tagged, and placed in cold storage. Time of death was estimated as 11:42 p.m. the night before. Her pulse was absent, pupils fixed, skin temperature non-reactive. She was 26 years old. The attending medical technician, Alan Ruiz, later testified to a state review panel that the body had been textbook cold and that nothing suggested the woman wasn't dead. 6 hours later, while Ruiz was conducting routine bin rotation, he heard a faint, wet rasp coming from storage unit 4B. Upon opening the drawer, he found the body gasping, eyes open, jaw twitching. She mouthed a word several times before vocalizing it aloud. Voss. Paramedics were called. Fletcher was rushed to the ER at Valley Lutheran Medical Center in East Phoenix, where she was placed on assisted ventilation. Her initial scans showed bilateral lung collapse consistent with prolonged breath suspension. Brain imaging revealed severe hypoxia, but no permanent damage. Doctors noted an unusual neurological pattern. Cora's vocal cords were spasming in rhythmic pulses, as though she were involuntarily counting down. Her blood work was unlike any case the hospital had seen. Toxicology returned low concentrations of chloral hydrate, pentobarbital, and a rare sedative blend, similar to substances found in veterinary applications, but chemically altered. Specialists confirmed she had undergone a medically induced state of suspended respiration, likely supported by breath training. The trauma was consistent with asphyxiation, controlled but pushed beyond safe limits. A tag on her toe read only R1082. That tag became the catalyst for a quiet joint investigation between the county coroner's office and state behavioral health investigators. Once the trace connected R1082 to the Crimson Threshold's Red Line Community Trust, investigators reopened old files flagged for irregularities, particularly surrounding the 1974 disappearance of Leona Morell. Cora remained hospitalized for 13 days. She did not speak for the first 5. When she did, her sentences came in clipped, rhythmic cadences. Interview transcripts indicate she struggled to break from return cadence, a psychological conditioning method employed inside the compound. Psychiatrists noted that she began and ended statements with numeric phrases. At one point, she described her ritual: you go below, you hold, you wait. If the bell comes, breathe. If not, stay. Cora confirmed the use of group sessions, chemical tonics, and the chamber of alignment. She recalled being selected for the deep return after receiving 3 consecutive red marks for exemplary breath control. Participants were not told if they would be revived. Instead, they were instructed to release will. She remembered the countdown. She remembered silence. She remembered waking up inside a metal drawer, unable to inhale fully, aware only of the cold and the ticking in her ears. Medical records show Cora's lungs remained scarred for over a year. Her breathing capacity never fully returned to normal. She later entered protective custody and declined further interviews. Her current whereabouts remain confidential. But her survival and her whisper changed everything. It marked the first concrete evidence of a living participant escaping the ritual intact, and it exposed a truth investigators couldn't ignore. The Crimson Threshold wasn't metaphor, it wasn't theory. It was action, timed, deliberate, and nearly irreversible. On August 4th, 1979, 2 days after Cora Fletcher's revival was confirmed by state authorities, a small tactical team from the Arizona Department of Public Safety was dispatched to a remote sector of Navajo County. Their coordinates pointed to a 27-acre desert compound registered under a nonprofit religious entity, the Red Line Community Trust. The trust had filed no tax reports in over a year. The land lease, signed by a proxy for Elijah Voss, was due for expiration. The convoy reached the perimeter at 6:12 a.m. Smoke was already rising. By 6:41 a.m., the site was declared compromised. The main structure, a low adobe-style chapel and its adjoining dormitories, had collapsed inward, flames long extinguished, leaving only skeletal beams and blackened earth. A perimeter sweep uncovered no living individuals, no vehicles, no movement. The heat had fused windows into warped shards. Door handles sagged, melted into the plaster walls. The soil beneath the chapel had cracked, exposing the foundation's underlayers. Within the wreckage, forensic responders found evidence of highly flammable accelerants, traces of thermite and lamp oil in copper drums along the north wall. The fire had not started naturally. It was staged. The chapel had served as the central hub of the compound. Its design followed the Crimson Threshold's belief in circular spatial flow. No altars, no pulpits, no traditional religious symbols. Instead, in the exact center of the ruin, fire crews uncovered a scorched wooden circle where 10 chairs had once stood. Their legs were reduced to ash, but the indentations remained, forming a perfect ring around a warped metal object, a red metronome. Despite the fire, the device remained intact, its glass casing shattered, internal mechanisms charred, but ticking, a faint mechanical click every second. Investigators recovered 11 red robes fused with bone fragments. Preliminary analysis confirmed 7 distinct DNA profiles. Some remains were too degraded for immediate identification. Forensic pathologists found fragments of surgical tubing, adhesive oxygen masks, and 2 industrial oxygen tanks warped by the heat. There were no fire escape routes, no exits had been marked, and no human footprints led out from the compound. Inside a blackened footlocker beside the chapel's rear entrance, investigators found fragments of what appeared to be codex of return copies, charred, partial pages fused together by heat and moisture. One page, still legible, read, "When the rhythm ceases in this world, it continues in the next. Let the circle close." Scattered in the ashes were shattered cassette tapes. Some bore timestamps matching those found in the Breathlog archive. Most were unreadable. One, partially intact, contained a final message. 37 seconds of silence followed by a single bell chime. The site was declared a federal interest zone by August 6th. In the weeks that followed, officials attempted to piece together a timeline. The fire had started in the early hours of August 3rd, just after news of Cora Fletcher's survival reached the public. Whether the burn was planned in anticipation or panic remains unclear, but what investigators found suggested ceremonial finality, not chaos. No firefighting alarms had been tripped, no emergency services were called, and no survivors ever came forward. The Crimson Threshold vanished into smoke, leaving behind no sermons, no bloodshed, just scorched ritual, silent machines, and the impression of 10 chairs in a circle, as if their occupants had never stood up. Only the ticking remained. In September 1979, nearly 6 weeks after the fire at the Crimson Threshold compound, 3 former members, 2 women and 1 man, were located in separate towns across the Southwest. Each had left the group before its final year. Each had changed their name, and each, when contacted, responded with the same initial word, rhythm. They were approached through sealed subpoenas and offered limited immunity in exchange for full cooperation. All 3 agreed to private interviews. The transcripts, later unsealed as part of the state's investigation, form the most complete picture available of life inside the Crimson Threshold. They described Elijah Voss not as a firebrand, but as deliberate, quiet, fixated on control through cadence. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. As one witness put it, he only spoke when we were out of breath. That's when you listened best. The room they all remembered most clearly was referred to in their testimonies as the reflection chamber. It had no lights, no windows, padded walls. Participants entered blindfolded and were guided to floor mats spaced evenly around the perimeter. In that room, they rehearsed dying. Each session followed a scripted sequence. First, they would lie still as a metronome ticked in the dark. Then a countdown would begin, always from 100. At 0, they were expected to hold their breath for as long as possible. When they gasped, they were removed from the room. No words were exchanged. One of the women, identified in transcripts only as KM, recalled how failure felt. It wasn't punishment. It was shame. Everyone else made it. You didn't. You weren't ready to cross. What they rehearsed was referred to internally as the play of surrender. Voss believed that the act of dying could be trained, like muscle memory. By simulating it enough times, he claimed, the fear would vanish. Participants were told that the moment of suffocation was not pain, but proof. The further they went into silence, the more they understood. In a 1977 session, the male witness, referred to as John, participated in what he believed was a full return trial. He was selected after completing 112 consecutive breath holds without deviation. He remembers being told, "Cross clean, return only if your rhythm is broken." He held his breath for nearly 4 minutes. When he woke, he was outside in the dirt, robe soaked through with sweat. No one spoke to him. His name was never used again. From that moment, he was referred to only as his codex number, R905. All 3 witnesses independently repeated the same phrase Voss used in final instruction: "We only need to cross once, then we'll never fear again." The phrase appeared word for word in recovered pages of the codex, written beneath a hand-drawn diagram of lungs surrounded by a red circle. None of the witnesses claimed they had seen a body during their time inside the compound. Death was spoken of only as an outcome, never shown, yet they all remembered the silence that followed a deep return. The closed doors, the changed names, the red stitching on the robes. The fire had destroyed most of the compound, but the memories survived, not of miracles, not of worship, but of a darkness rehearsed, breath by breath, in a room with no light, until the fear became something else, until it became rhythm. When investigators combed through the remains of the Crimson Threshold compound in the weeks following the fire, they cataloged 11 distinct sets. Of partial remains, 7 were matched to known members. The rest were too degraded to identify. DNA testing in 1979 was limited in scope and cost, and fire had erased most distinguishing features. But one certainty emerged: none of the remains belonged to Elijah Voss. Federal authorities had anticipated finding his body, either among the ashes or buried on site. Voss had not been seen outside the compound in nearly 2 years. Witness testimony confirmed he had presided over the final Red Hour ceremony just weeks before the fire, yet his name was missing from the alignment registry logs for August 3rd, the night of the presumed mass immolation. A nationwide bulletin was issued on August 9, 1979. Voss was declared a person of interest in connection with suspected unlawful deaths, misuse of controlled substances, and operating an unlicensed religious medical facility. His name was entered into the newly formed NCIC Federal Watch List system under case number 79 FE1073. Posters bearing his face, taken from a 1972 seminary ID, were circulated to hospitals, shelters, and police precincts across the Southwest, but no confirmed sightings followed. The search revealed little. No financial accounts, no confirmed aliases, no surviving family. The only documentation linking Voss to the outside world were 3 notarized leases, each signed under the same name, and a single faded driver's license issued in 1968, expired. In October 1979, a partial journal page surfaced during cleanup efforts. It was found beneath the floorboards of the reflection chamber. The handwriting matched other confirmed samples from Voss. According to a bureau forensics analyst, it read, "If the body burns, the name remains. If the breath stops, the rhythm carries it forward. Return is optional. Investigators considered the possibility that Voss had died alongside his followers, his remains simply too damaged to distinguish, but several facts contradicted this. First, unlike other Inner Circle members, no robe bearing Voss's identifier, R-000, was recovered from the chamber. Second, a pair of dusty tire tracks was discovered roughly 200 yards from the compound's rear service trail. The tracks led to a flat expanse of scrubland, but stopped abruptly. Forensic teams noted the prints were fresh, possibly made within 48 hours of the fire. A boot impression was found near the tracks, size 11, not consistent with any recovered victims. Third, a burned envelope was recovered from a nearby outbuilding. The paper was mostly charred, but fragments of the address survived. It was never mailed. Inside were 3 unmarked Polaroids, a desert road, a gas station at dusk, and a man's silhouette facing away from the camera. Short silver hair, military-style jacket. Analysts could not confirm the subject's identity. The investigation remained open. Over the years, occasional tips surfaced. A man matching Voss's description, seen in a diner near Tucson in 1982. A silent hitchhiker near Needles in 1985. A breathwork guru in Baja California in the early 90s. None were confirmed. The name Elijah Voss remains in the NCIC database. As of 2025, it has not been removed. No death certificate was issued. No grave was found. No verified statement ever confirmed what became of him. But those who knew him inside the threshold rarely said missing. They said he chose not to return. In late 1980, nearly a year after her revival, Cora Fletcher was transferred from state custody to a long-term psychiatric evaluation facility in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the time, she had been under observation for 13 months, her speech still marked by rhythmic cadences and breath spacing. She was considered stable, but psychologically imprinted, conditioned by the Crimson Threshold's internal doctrine. Her sessions were recorded. One directive, given by her clinical team, was to draw from memory anything she recalled about the compound's layout, ritual structures, or spaces used during return procedures. Over the course of several weeks, Cora produced 6 distinct architectural sketches, each drafted in silence, unprompted. Each sketch featured the same anomaly, a rectangular chamber labeled in shaky handwriting as below. This room did not appear on any known floor plans recovered after the fire. It was not listed in the Red Line Community Trust's building permits filed in 1974. Satellite imagery taken between 1976 and 1979 showed no visible expansion or subterranean construction. Yet below appeared in every one of Cora's drawings, in the same location, under the chapel, but offset to the east. No stairwell connected it. Instead, a ladder, always vertical, always marked as narrow. When presented with these sketches, the 3 former witnesses interviewed the previous year were asked independently about the chamber. All 3 named it. All 3 described it the same way: silent, low-ceilinged, without lights. They claimed it was accessed only for final stage rituals, when an initiate had crossed at least twice in supervised ceremony. One witness, John, described the protocol. You went in blindfolded. You weren't told how long. When they pulled you out, they didn't say anything. If you made a sound in there, you were disqualified. Another witness, KM, claimed below was designed specifically for sensory removal. No ventilation, no reflected sound, no detectable movement. She said there was no floor as such, only fine, cooled sand to muffle breathing. Investigators initially dismissed the chamber as symbolic or hallucinatory, but a re-examination of fire scene photos from the chapel ruins revealed a partially collapsed duct opening beneath the rear altar, just beyond the metronome's placement. Its presence was overlooked in early reports due to structural instability. In 1981, A limited dig was approved. What they found confirmed parts of the sketches. A narrow shaft, approximately 9 feet deep and 3 feet across. The interior walls were lined with heat-scorched plaster over corrugated steel. No ladders remained. At the base, fire damage was less severe, suggesting the chamber had been sealed off prior to the blaze. Scattered in the soil were remnants: a rusted alarm bell, surgical gauze, and an oxygen mask marked R113. No human remains were found. Despite the physical evidence, no official designation was added to the architectural record. Below remains an informal label. Cora stopped drawing 2 months later. Her final image, rendered in blue crayon on state-issued sketch paper, showed a single dark rectangle with a caption scrawled underneath in red pencil. Only the ones who made no sound were allowed to return. To this day, below is the only room from the Crimson Threshold for which no construction records, blueprints, or permits exist. But 4 witnesses remembered it, and all 4 placed it exactly where the foundation cracked. On March 11, 1994, nearly 15 years after the Crimson Threshold compound burned to ash, an unmarked envelope arrived at the home of journalist Douglas Raymer in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The envelope bore no return address, no postmark, and no identifying handwriting. It had been slid under his door sometime during the night. Inside, folded carefully in thirds, was a single yellowed sheet of paper, typewritten, unevenly spaced, and weathered at the corners. The top of page bore a familiar title: Codex of Return, Section 7. The body of the text consisted of a dense paragraph, formatted like a doctrinal teaching, though no version of the codex on record contained this exact language. At the bottom of the page was a single line, underlined in red pencil: to be changed forever. One must leave for just long enough to miss the air. Raymer, who had covered the Threshold case in its early days, immediately recognized the formatting. The codex had always been printed on recycled pulp stock with faded red borders. The typeface matched other surviving pages found during the 1979 investigation. The phrasing bore the same chilling cadence, sparse, deliberate, and fixated on breath as a spiritual medium. But this page was previously undocumented. It did not match any of the 47 archived fragments held by state authorities. It bore no annotation, no codex number. The language suggested it was part of a deeper section, perhaps a final instruction, or a private edition reserved only for inner circle initiates. Raymer brought the page to forensic archivists at the University of New Mexico's Special Collections Library. Their analysis confirmed the document's likely age and printing method: late 1970s IBM Selectric typewriter, printed on a rare form of chemically untreated parchment. Traces of red iron oxide on the underline matched markings found in other codex samples. But the real mystery was its origin. Raymer had not published on the Threshold in over a decade. His last article, a feature on Witness KM in 1983, had been quietly buried after editorial pushback. He had since moved on to freelance assignments unrelated to cults or fringe movements. His address was not public, yet someone had found him, and someone had chosen this message, this sentence, to send. Authorities were notified. The envelope and paper were tested for fingerprints. None were recovered. The paper showed signs of preservation, stored in dry, controlled conditions, free of mold or insect damage. It had not been recently handled in bulk. Raymer was not the only one. Over the following 18 months, 3 other former investigators reported receiving similar pages, each from different sections of the codex, each ending in a line underlined in red. One read, "Silence is not absence, it is preparation." Another, "The lungs are not the end, only the gate." The final recipient, a retired forensic linguist, received a note stapled to a partial cassette insert with no tape inside. The note read, "He is breathing, just elsewhere." None of these messages led to further arrests. No new locations were uncovered, and no trace of Elijah Voss ever surfaced again. But among Threshold researchers, one belief persists: not supernatural, Not paranoid, just a hypothesis formed by patterns that somewhere, in controlled air and rhythm, someone is still practicing the return, and they want the record to remain incomplete, just enough to keep us listening. Whatever the crimson threshold was, it didn't end in fire. It ended in silence, and maybe that was the point. Some doors, once opened, don't close. If you want more stories like this, forgotten cults, buried truths, and the ones who vanished, subscribe, follow, and stay with us. We're just getting started.